I read that in the Federal Reserve Act, there's a Section 30, and I think I got this in Ron Paul's book, and the Fed.
Right.
You know, he's been working his whole career pretty much to try to audit the Fed and the Fed and try to get back to constitutional money. And since Congress has the authority to change the laws, like, do you think that there's a realistic chance that it can be changed constitutionally by Congress?
Well, I wouldn't do it by Congress. Section 30 reserves the power of Congress to alter, amend, repeal the Federal Reserve Act. You know why that was there? Because Congress recognizes the Federal Reserve as a private organization, or a structure of private organizations, because all the banks are private organizations. And there's a doctrine in constitutional law which prevents a legislature from changing a private corporate charter. This is the famous Dartmouth College case, which occurred in the early 1800s. So what you find after the Dartmouth College case is the state legislatures and Congress would put these provisions in statutes in which they knew they were giving powers or privileges to private parties. They would put a reservation of authority for the legislature in these statutes saying, we can revoke or amend these privileges. And once it was there, that private party could not claim, oh, well, this contract can't be changed. This is not really a contract. Right? It's in the Social Security Act. As a for instance, people think, so, oh, Social Security, this is a contract they can't change. It's wrong. There's a provision in the Social Security Act so they can change it anytime they want. And they've done it over and over and over again. They could simply stop paying Social Security tomorrow, all constitutional because of the way they wrote the statute. All right. The difficulty they have is the same difficulty you would have if you went to the Supreme Court and said, we want you to declare this unconstitutional. How do you change it without deranging the economy?
Right.
National as well, potentially as international. Right? You can't just flip your fingers, snap your fingers, and change things overnight with some comprehensive statute. And all the Austrian economists, including Ron Paul, because I take him to be an Austrian school thinker, will tell you this. Right? It cannot be done. You can't exchange one system for another overnight. It has to be some kind of gradual process. So what I've been proposing for years is, look, let's go to the states. The states have the power to make gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts because they can make nothing but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. It's a reserve power. So we want the states to pass a gold and silver legal tender act within their own jurisdictions. And they could start off with US gold and silver coin. They could start off with foreign gold and silver coin. They can't mint their own coins, but they can use coins minted by someone else. And so now we have that kind of a system circulating within the states. And the proposal, actually, I put this up. We had it before the committee in the New Hampshire legislature. We had it before a committee in the Montana legislature. Some other legislative people were looking at state legislative people. And essentially what it did was it created a circular flow, take a particular part of the tax structure of the state. We essentially use the tobacco taxes, because those are sin taxes, number one. Most people don't look at those as, the tobacco industry is something that's particularly favored. And number two, the people who pay tobacco taxes are these corporations. They get their tax stamps, they pay for the tax stamps, they put the tax stamps on the various products, and the products come in for sale. So those people could administer this process very simply. And the idea would be that the tax people are required to pay in gold and silver coin to the Treasury in the state, and then the Treasury in the state offers to pay state creditors gold and silver coin on a first come, first served basis. And then supposedly, I would hope, the state creditors who now had gold and silver coin would begin thinking about using this in gold and silver contracts. And the tobacco people would have to get gold and silver coin to pay their taxes, so they would begin making gold and silver contracts. And slowly this would begin circulating through the commercial economy within that state. And the state treasurer would come back, I would think very quickly, back to the state legislature and say, you know what's happening here? We're getting X amount of gold and silver each year from these tobacco taxes, relatively small amount of tax, and it's going out the door as fast as it comes in. We want you to go to another area of our tax structure and require that gold and silver be paid. All right? And slowly but surely, this would make a very large percentage of the state economy into a gold and silver economy. You have competition between the state economy in gold and silver and the state economy in Federal Reserve notes. And I wonder which direction that would go in.
Yeah, it sounds like if they adopt that, it's free market.
Well, yeah, then you have
sound
competition.
money.
That's why you have
It's
competition.
competition.
The Austrian school people would tell you that under those circumstances, the free market is going to eventually dominate the unfree market.
And
And
it's
the
not
beauty of that system is that there's no way that Congress could interfere with it.
right. You're saying that it's not like it's an unconstitutional or illegal thing. It's actually just nobody's interested in doing it right now because of the way the system is, and the money history's been lost, and people just aren't as engaged anymore.
Yeah, I think nobody really thinks about this. The example I give is on that point is Texas. You know, Texas set up a state depository for gold, and actually now I think it operates so that anyone can put silver into it as well. And it started off because the state had a fair amount of gold in its teachers' pension fund, some other pension fund that was held outside of the state, and some state legislators thought this was imprudent. They wanted to have control within the state. So they passed a statute, create a state depository, bring this gold back. And the depository essentially can function as a gold and silver bank now. Any citizen of the state, I guess any citizen anywhere, can deposit gold and silver in that depository, and it can be then paid out one way or another. So the last couple of years, well, it goes back now maybe 3 or 4 years, I and some other friends of mine in Texas drafted some legislation that would enable gold clause and silver clause contracts to be more easily used within the state, and tied that into the state depository. So now they would have a depository, they'd have state statutes that dealt with gold and silver clauses protected by eventually the Supreme Court decisions that came from the 1860s and 1870s. And the idea was now they had a mechanism, the state depository, for deposits and payments. Now they had a legal system that could be effectuated through the courts for making these contracts effective easily. And once you gave that to people, you would hope that people would take advantage of it. Well, the difficulty was they never passed the what I would call the enabling legislation. That never got out of committee. And the problem here is, and I've seen this every time this kind of legislation, whatever it was that I've drafted, it goes into some committee, and the people in charge of that committee give thumbs down.
Why do you think that is? It's just
because they make calls to the bankers, or the bankers make calls to them. I mean, people know what bills are being put in.
Right.
The bankers look at this, oh, you can't. And I'll give you the classic example that's in Virginia. I've worked on this twice in Virginia. And I suppose other states have this same type of vision. Virginia has the ability for the General Assembly, the Virginia legislature, to enact bills for study commissions. And the study commissions usually contain a couple of legislators from each party and some experts or whatever. And they will deal with a specific issue. They'll study that issue. Maybe they'll hold hearings, bring in experts or testimony, whatever it is. And then they will propose to the legislature what ought to be done, or maybe what ought not to be done. I'm going to build a bridge over the dam, you know, in Danville or something. Study that, come back and say, yes, we should finance the building of a bridge. All right. So I worked with this one legislator on a number of occasions to have a study commission to deal with this exact question. How could the Commonwealth of Virginia protect itself and its citizens against a very serious monetary and banking failure within the United States, whether it was a depressionary failure, hyperinflationary failure, whichever end of that spectrum you're on? How might it do this by coming up with a state alternative currency system? How this would protect the finances of the state, tax revenues, all right? How it would protect commercial transactions within the state, which are the basis of tax revenues and also of the well-being of the citizens. All I wanted to do was to have a commission set up and bring in some experts. And I was going to get we had experts from George Mason University. I mean, these weren't people that were living in cardboard boxes on subway gratings, right? These are people who knew what they were talking about. We're going to bring our own experts in, have the testimony. It couldn't be done. They wouldn't even do that.
Oh, brutal.
All right, they wouldn't even listen to the possibility that this might be useful under some circumstances. And what I've always argued to people is, look, you pass one of these statutes, and if no one wants to use it, it just sits there like an insurance policy. Right? You get an insurance policy, you hope you don't die, you hope you don't have the catastrophic car accident, but you have the policy in case those things happen. And that was the whole argument I always made about these alternative currency systems. People might not want them. People might be perfectly happy with the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System might continue to function with a modicum of stability. But what if it doesn't? What is your alternative? And the answer is you have nothing now.
Yeah.
Right? You're at the mercy of fate, in a sense. If you put a system like this in...
The states are just kind of like following the lead of the Fed, I guess. Is that the system?
Well, whatever. Yeah, they'll lead us over the edge, over the cliff, right? Wherever they take us. If you have this alternative system, some people will use it. There'll always be the odd individuals that will want to make gold and silver clause contracts.
Do you think there's anything like to the... Oh, sorry, go ahead. You're finished.
No, but I was going to say, but in the extreme situation, when enough people woke up and said, this is what we have to do to protect ourselves, or this is what the state treasurer said to the governor, this is what I have to do to stabilize my income, my real income here in taxes. There's the system to use. It's already there. It's like the insurance policy. We don't have to call up Prudential and see if we can negotiate the policy when we've been diagnosed with terminal heart disease.
Right.
And the amazing thing to me is to watch how the legislative process suppresses this. In some instances, we weren't even able to get hearings because key figures in the committees to which these bills were assigned said no. And then you look at their backgrounds and you realize why they said no. In other instances, it was because of the composition of the committee, Democrats versus Republicans.
Okay.
In Montana, we finally got it out of committee and got it to the floor of the House of Representatives. And it was the Democrats and a few, what they call Republicans in name only, that type of Republican, who defeated it in the House. And it was like 52 to 48. I mean, it was close. Right? But didn't get out because all the Democrats voted against it and a small group of Republicans voted against it, so it just disappeared. So those bills are sitting around, they're on the internet. You change the title of the state and you change the provisions where it talks about particular statutory sections, and you could make the bill apply to some other state. They're kind of generic in that sense. But the problem is the legislators don't understand it. There are special interests that try to spike it every time it appears. Average people in the state don't have enough knowledge and interest to demand this from their legislators. The media doesn't talk about it. If you go to Wikipedia, you read nothing but nonsense.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything to, I mean, as in the Bitcoin space, you hear, we follow a lot of financial news and macro news and worldwide news of currencies failing all over the world and everything. Do you think that there's anything serious to this narrative that Russia and China are hoarding lots of gold and they're trying to create like a gold-backed currency to replace the US dollar as a global reserve currency?
Well, I'll believe it when I see the currency come out. First, they have to do it internally.
Right.
They have to bring their own internal economies on that gold system before they ever get involved in any kind of international transactions. And then, of course, the question is if you're going to make gold clause contracts with foreign governments on a government-to-government level, or if you're going to make gold clause contracts on a commercial level. Corporation in Russia makes a gold clause contract with Germany. How's that going to be enforced? What are the rules? If you go into a German court, how do German courts treat gold clause contracts? How do American courts treat gold clause contracts? If you made a Russian corporation or a Chinese corporation makes a gold clause contract with an American corporation, going to be enforced in the American courts?
I think the way that I was understanding that they're saying it's just going to be a paper currency, but that's backed by gold reserves, just like the dollar used to be. I think that's the concept.
Oh, well, then I would just scoff at that. No. The only way I believe that if these people were serious, oh no, there's a gold currency. We're making gold and silver clause transactions.
Right, because they can always do.
We don't need. Why would we need paper currency? The only reason you have paper currency is to have more paper than you have the gold or silver.
Right, so they're going to rehypothecate, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the gold certificate and the silver certificates. There were trust funds in the Treasury. They had to have an actual gold coin or an actual silver coin for each piece of paper they put out. And the reason that was put out was for convenience only.
Right.
People, rather than carrying around 50 silver dollars in a bag, you have a $50 silver certificate, right?
Right.
That was the only reason. Oh, and I could understand that. You would have a paper currency, you would have electronic transfer or whatever, but it would have to be legally tied back to that particular piece of gold or silver in the Russian treasury. Or I wouldn't trust the Chinese, all right, but whatever, this foreign government's treasury.
Right.
But then the question always comes to my mind, what happens when one of those contracts is going to be enforced internationally? No problem within Russia. They would probably have the correct statute to do that. But you have a Russian corporation or a German corporation dealing with Russia, and the law of enforcement is specified in the contract to be Germany or France or whatever it is. Do those countries have a way of enforcing those contracts such that actual gold is going to be paid from their citizens?
So you think that the likely scenario then is that we're not going to be moving to any kind of a gold standard any soon, and the fiat experiment is just going to continue until it blows up, I guess?
Yeah, well, there may be other reasons that things blow up, but before the fiat system does, but yes.
Well, Dr. Vieira,
we could do it in the United States right now, as I said before. We have the right to make gold clause contracts. The courts have already determined how those are supposed to be enforced. We have gold and silver coinage coming out of the Treasury, and there's international gold and silver coinage that we could be using as well, because a gold clause contract is not limited to U.S. gold and silver coin. Do you see any of that happening? And the answer is,
yeah.
Well, if it is,
I don't see it
behind the scenes somewhere in the darkness, right? That is not happening. So you'd have to have a rather large player to get that going. And that was my whole theory. If you get a state doing it, the state would become the pump primer on that system. If you had a foreign country doing it, right? But a state would be doing it within the U.S. legal system, where we know exactly what's going to be done with a gold clause contract in terms of enforcement, assuming that the courts are going to be honest about it. When you start talking internationally, it raises another problem. So I would like to see it first in a state, and then more than one state, and putting pressure on Congress. So Congress might have to authorize some agencies of the federal government to enter into gold clause and silver clause contracts, and the thing begins to spread like oil on water. And then at some stage, I would think that once that stabilizes within the United States, foreign countries, Canada, for instance, probably the first one, right? Mexico, maybe the second one, would be saying, well, we're going to make cross-border gold and silver clause contracts because we know those can be enforced within the United States. We're not going to be cheated out of our gold and silver by some sort of legal tender screw up. So, which has happened before. That's why the whole thing collapsed, because government stepped in and said, forget it. You may have a gold and silver clause contract in principle, but we're now going to change that to a legal tender contract and cheat you out of some value.
So do you think that, I mean, that's what happened in the 70s, right? When the U.S. went off the gold standard, everybody was under this paradigm that the dollar was backed by gold and redeemable by gold. And then Nixon just said, nope.
Surprise. Forget it.
Yeah. So
that's what Roosevelt did. That's what Roosevelt did in 33. It was backed by gold. Federal Reserve note was backed by gold. And Roosevelt said, no longer. Oh, and by the way, we're depreciating the value of gold anyway, from $20 to $35.
So I reread Ron Paul's and the Fed before the interview, so I want to have like a refresher in my mind. And in Jeff Booth's book, The Price of Tomorrow, so he explains that technology is it has deflationary effects on the economy. And, as technology makes things cheaper. And the Federal Reserve should stop trying to fight technology. because they're trying to they have a mandate of rising prices and inflation. And he says that technology is actually the free market making things cheaper, but the Federal Reserve is trying to make things more expensive. So instead of trying to centrally plan, the Federal Reserve should just stop trying to fight falling prices caused by advancements in technology and innovation. And in Ron Paul's book, And the Fed, he says that when you look at the last quarter of the 20th century, there was an increased purchasing power accompanied by one of the greatest periods of economic growth in history. He said the last quarter of the 20th century is also when we went off the gold standard. So thinking about it in those terms, where in the last quarter of the 20th century, we went off the gold standard, we had an increase in purchasing power and an increase of technology that made things cheaper. Do you think that, because now, I mean, if you fast forward to now, 2020, do you think that the explosion of capitalism and like the effects of technology and the economic growth that we've been seeing up until the COVID crash, right? Do you think it's due to the deflationary effects of technology or going off the gold standard, or is it something else?
Well, I don't think it's imputable to going off the gold standard.
Because that's what some critics will say. They'll say, because when you bring up in say like people that are progressive politics or they're on the left, really hard left, like they're advocating modern monetary theory or UBI or something like that, and you say, well, we should move back to like an Austrian style hard money system that's constrains the power of government to redistribute wealth so willy-nilly. They'll always say to you, well, look at going off the gold standard, we had the biggest boom and lift in prices and asset prices, and it seems to be that going off the gold standard was a good thing for the economy because look how much it grew in the last century.
Well, yeah, but there's a difference between real terms and monetary terms. Prices can increase in monetary terms, but they're not increasing in real terms. All right. You go back to the turn of the 20th century, and the Austrians will point out what was happening. You had, I hate to use the word deflationary. It wasn't deflation. It was appreciation. It was appreciation of gold and silver currency. And what was this doing? This was raising the real value of workers' income without the workers necessarily doing anything about it. Simultaneously, there was an increase in technology, which was also raising the real value of workers' income in the sense that they could get better products at cheaper cost, all right? And this was a period in which there was the only inflation in the system. This was before the Federal Reserve. The only inflation in the system was more gold and silver that was being coined, and that was a limited amount because the market controlled it. And the amount of currency that could be put out by the national banks, and this was limited by the amount of debt that the Treasury was willing to incur, which was low because there was an anti-debt policy following the Civil War before World War I. So you had a terrific increase in the relative wealth of the United States versus Europe. And this was the takeoff point for the United States becoming a dominant economic power in the world. What would happen today? Now, today the technological advances would be what, order of magnitude or more greater than they were at the turn of the 20th century?
Right.
I mean, you
I would
whatever
say,
number you want. It's a large number.
yeah.
All right. The gold and silver economy would be still constrained. I guess we have more gold and silver now than we had then, but the increase in gold and silver would still be constrained by the costs of mining, refining, and minting, and so forth and so on. So you'd have an appreciation in the value of the coinage of the money system, and you'd have an increase in technological development. And therefore, those people in the lower half of the economy whose standard of living was dependent upon wages or returns from investment in productive companies, it would be going up, right?
Yeah, I'd imagine.
That seems like the logical conclusion of this, and it would be going up at a faster rate than it was going up at the turn of the 20th century, simply because technology is advancing that much more quickly. If you make the assumption that technology is one of the drivers of this, all right, which I'm willing to accept, having been a scientist for many years. So I would look at this and say, all right, so there's another advantage of going to the gold and silver system. Not only do we constrain the government, stop the government from wasting, stop the government from engaging in unconstitutional actions through bribery, but we influence the ability of the market system to increase the well-being of the lower half or the lower 2/3 of the economy, and probably more than anything else, the lower 10 or 15% of the economy, right? Those people whose incomes, whose wealth is entirely dependent upon wages. They have nothing else. They have no investments, right? Their welfare is dependent on how much money do I get per week, how much money do I get per month, right? And what those people would want to see is appreciating value of the money they get and increasing technological advances so that the money that they get can buy more advanced and better products. And that's why the union movement in this country, before it went socialist, when it was people like Samuel Gompers who were leading it, the AFL, the original AFL, the union movement, if you read their literature at the turn of the 20th century, late 1800s and into the early 20th century, they were perhaps the biggest proponents of a sound currency system, a gold and silver currency system, because they understood that. They understood that the average working man was dependent for his welfare upon stable money, and even better, appreciating money. They didn't want inflationary economic policies because this worked directly to their disadvantage.
Well,
and that's again one of the things that we've lost. You look at the union movement. Well, of course, a lot of the union movement is tied up in the public sector, so they're feeding off the whole government rip-off monetary system. But you look at the union movement in the private sector, and these people have no conception of why the Federal Reserve is actually working against their best interests, or the best interests of at least the union members that they supposedly represent, that the big union operations supposedly represent. But you read the AFL publications in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they understood it very, very, I mean, those are sophisticated articles you'll read in those union newspapers. These people understood perfectly well what money was all about and what it meant to them. So I would say today, if one wanted to have a political movement that would amalgamate the quote unquote toiling masses, as the Marxists like to say, on behalf of a sound economy, limited government, maximum freedom, gold and silver coinage is what we want. And it doesn't have to be coinage, because we're pretty sophisticated now. You can put bars, right? And we can do this all electronically. You can set up systems whereby you're transferring, well, the computers don't care how many zeros after the decimal point, right? 0.000001 troy ounce, right? 1 grain, whatever. We can now do the thing that was impossible to do under the gold coinage system, which is to make small change. Remember when you had the gold and silver coinage system, there were coins only of certain sizes, and that was it. Otherwise, you had the so-called token coinages, the nickels, the pennies. That was the system. And so the prices tended to be a little bit more arbitrary than they should have been, because they had to be expressed in terms of coinage that people could actually get their hands on, could actually use. Today, with the electronic systems, you can put a gold bar, a gold $20 gold piece. Let's take $50 gold piece, American Eagle. Right? You got this in deposit in a state depository, and you can use that as the basis for any amount up to an ounce of gold that you want to put out electronically. So the system now, the technology has finally made it possible to use the gold and silver system in the most economically advantageous way. So we have all those things going for us. We have that technology and money. We have the technology in advancing product development, purchasing power. and wages. This is the unique time in world history we can all be put together. And what's happening? The government, the bankers, the big financiers in Wall Street or wherever they're hiding out, they're all against this. Why? Because it's against their economic interest to do this. I mean, in this sense, Marx was right. The big capitalists do not want to share their wealth with the toiling masses. And the only way the toiling masses are ever going to get control of this system is to go back to a sound monetary system that controls two things: the government and the big corporations. Because the big corporations will no longer be able to use the banks to get bailouts and all the rest of these financial manipulations that keep their heads above water when the financial system fails us in one way or another.